G'day legends, I hope you're having a fantastic day and so far you are having a great week. Now legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over. But in the beginning of this video, I need to say that this video may be delayed 24 hours. If that is the case, we will have today's update at the end and yesterday's update at the beginning. As today, what I'm trying to do is set up with a subject matter expert on Chinese weapon systems. An interview with himself will go through the parade and talk about those systems that we saw. So keep an eye out for that. But today is the 4th of September. That sounds crazy to say. So this may be in chronological order. But of course, we have a lot to go over. So we're going to talk about Trump, China, and what we saw yesterday at the military parade in China to do with not the weapons themselves, that'll be for the interview, but as far as Putin, Xi, Kim, all this axis of upheaval together in solidarity. Then we'll talk about the maps. We'll look at some geolocations we've got, weapons being used, tactics we're seeing used again. A fair bit of that to go over, as well as DRG elements. But as I've been promising you for now a few days, is going through a book review on this Russia against modernity from Professor Alexander Etkin. Now we're going to go through my critiques, where I think this falls over, where I think it's strong. We'll put it against what we know about released in Putin's decrees or from Dugin, and put that all together, because I think this makes some really good points, but some really, really bold assumptions coming out of Austria. So that will be at the end. So we see this, Trump tweeting this. Now, I actually had to look up whether this was real, because a lot of people make fake tweets of what Trump has said on truth.com. But at the same time as well, sometimes I need to, like, that can't be real. And then I look and go, oh, it is. The big question to be answered is whether or not Xi of China will mention the massive amount of support and blood that the United States of America gave to China in order to help it secure freedom from a very unfriendly foreign invader. Many Americans died in China's quest for victory and glory. I hope they are rightfully honoured and remembered for their bravery and sacrifice. May Xi and the wonderful people of China have a great and lasting day of celebration. Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America, President Donald J. Trump. So give regards to Putin, Kim, and Xi as well, that you are conspiring against America. And this is that multipolar lines being drawn in the sand that we are seeing. And America being left out. And what we are seeing is these nations, from the SCO through to this, that they are saying we don't need West involvement. We want to go on our own path and trajectory. But to look at this, Trump is not outright lying, but he is exaggerating of the secure China's freedom. Now, China, they bore the brunt of the war with Japan for blood, for people. They lost more than 10 million people. American aid, it was important, but it was still limited. And when we talk about the Second World War, the catastrophe of the Second World War, tens of millions of deaths, we need to look back and remember and honour all of those who fought for freedom, for honour as well. And do we ever, at Trump's recent parade, of which I'm sure he'll be unfathomably jealous of Xi's parade, and I'm sure Putin's pretty jealous of Xi's parade, but at any of those, all parades in Australia, when we remember, we honour the soldiers of these wars, do we ever honour or recognise the Soviets or the Chinese? People in the West have a completely skewed vision, especially in America, of how the Second World War actually unfolded. And according to Trump, the US did all of the fighting in World War II. And so I guess soz to Churchill and the British. So, but you can see where there's a lot of tension at the moment, and that this global south, axis of upheaval, axis of evil, whatever you want to call it, that it is really moving on its own trajectory, and where the West and it may split off. And again, this doesn't mean that you will get a hegemon, but it does mean we are moving towards, and have probably been in for longer than we realise, a multipolar world. And China is trying to cement themselves as the head of this. And India is trying to balance between the two poles of it. Now, let's have a look at the maps. We do have a fair bit to go over. Of course, here is Ukraine in the centre of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. Red areas occupied since 22, purple since 2014. Any red check that you see when we turn on these arrows, that is Russian advancement over the past 24 hours. So let's come down into Pokrovsk. No changes shown on this map, except for this area around Zolotokolodiaz has turned green, but that is just post 2 weeks occurring. But let's have a look at some geolocations around here as well on the eastern side. So we see where Rusin Yar is. We see in this footage a Russian flag going up. Now, at the moment, with the porosity of the front line, we do know there's a lot of flag waving operations, but this is just behind, outside of the grey zone of Rusin Yar. Now, that's definitely grey zone if there's any presence of forces at all. Now, while we're on the east, let's have a look at what Suryak is saying about this. So, situation on this front. Russian army restarted advances north of Nikhodovka and re-entered Novoshakovky and approached Vilny. So he is saying they've re-entered Novoshakovky and are on the verge of Vilny, but you can see on this map in here. If we move down into then the Minograd, Novokonomanchne area, he is shown just at the bottom here, pushing back on the Russian forces in this frontline area too. You can see where those quarries lay. So it is difficult to get an idea exactly what is happening around here, but according to his map, fattening the base of this push that has come out. Again, we'll wait for further confirmation from other maps and or geolocations. But we see this footage come out today. And what this appears to show is Russian soldiers in a sewer tunnel, or at least it definitely does show Russian soldiers in a tunnel. And of course, there's that very famous operation in Kursk Oblast of the Russians moving through that pipe and then getting right in behind the Ukrainians, causing chaos. And it's not the first time underground facilities have been used like that. Now, exactly where is this? We don't know, but it was being reported from Russian pages in and around Pokrovsk. So Mr. Thorkill65, who does a fantastic job, he's written about this and added some geolocations too. Speaking about on the Telegram where the video came out, that it's been reported that advance by Russian forces near the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk in these areas and Market District. So that there's been rapid advancements in some of these areas. In his latest post, topic from this morning, he claimed Russian assault groups are approaching the railway in Pokrovsk. It's possible that the video and radar's information are somehow connected. However, Ukrainian Telegram channels remain silent about the entire situation, so it might be some kind of hoax. So what he's saying is we've got this footage and then we get reports of rapid advancement. Now, this is speculative at best, but at this first geolocation right in here, so just on this edge down to the southwest of Pokrovsk and then in the Pokrovsk railway. And again, he's putting these two together, saying if this video is real and it is in Pokrovsk, maybe this explains the reporting here. Again, speculative, but it's worth putting out there for when we may see it, may not. So let's move our way up into Kupiansk. Now, one change on this map today is Moskovska has gone from being blue to then being grey. What we saw yesterday was where Ukraine put up a flag the day before, Russia then put up a flag yesterday, and the flag waving operation continues. But we have a lot more flags going up. And of course, it's not boy who cries wolf, not all flags then mean it's just that operation. Also, with the frontline nature, it's difficult and the amount of DRGs working at the moment. Military Summary and other channels, Creamy Caprice, they geolocate Russian flags all down through Kupiansk. So you can see on the northern side and you can see right down in here, right down into the center of Kupiansk, Russian flags going up, confirmed of this footage here. Now, I don't need to show you all of the footage, but multiple flags going up in multiple areas. Now, that one on the tower that we saw go up the other day, that one was definitely dropped by a drone, but this is a zoom out to show the location. That's where we see the tower, but the tower on the other day, you can't take that how some may have. Now, let's have a look at what then Deep State has said about this. Enemy presence in Kupiansk. and their attempts to infiltrate the city. Today, the enemy published footage showing their flag displayed in various parts of the city and Kupiansk. Once again, turning it into propaganda. In particular, the recording of Invader was even in the city centre where they roamed freely for some time. The flag display itself took place in locations in the grey zone, but if taking place in grey zone, that grey zone should extend. The presence of enemy in the northern outskirts of Kupiansk is not news, and the prolonged existence of the grey zone demonstrates this. The invaders constantly attempt to infiltrate the city and try to establish a foothold, at least in the outskirts, to increase their numbers and further advancement. So accumulate forces in an attempt to advance, as we do see working with other elements in the paint-by-number strategy, the triple choke, whatever you'd like to call it. And the Defence Force fighters, of course, try to reduce these attempts to zero, but the enemy's advantage in infantry is evident. To increase their chance of establishing themselves in the city, the enemy tries to control the surrounding area, as per the strategies that we know are being used. It is also no secret that the enemy disguise themselves in civilian clothes to sneak into the city to carry out various plans. However, this story is not limited to the current situation with flag displays in somewhat broader scope, as the enemy disguises to infiltrate the city and increase their numbers there. According to fighters' reports, there is concern that at some point this could lead to unpleasant consequences, but we'll also see over time the extensive enemies the plans were. We got to just a glimpse of this in Pokrovsk and on the eastern side of Pokrovsk also. Of course, we got those blue-on-blue incidents, DRG ambushes, all of this. In September, we'll repeatedly talk about Kupiansk because the enemy has come very close to actively probing weak spots, which they've already identified to some extent. But they immediately began to develop their successes. So, again, we will see, but they are very correct in saying that over September, Kupiansk will come to more of the forefront of our reporting and what we see in the war. So let's move our way down until we see some red check. And the only red check on this map today is around Melanivka, Yanvarske, and right down here in Komar. Remember, the grey zone between Novosilivska and Komar is just over 16 kilometres, which I find hard to believe that it would look like this. We see Suryak's map, which is in the same area here around Melivka, that between Komashuvka, a series of positions have come under control of the Russian forces, which just makes more sense in the type of war between Melanivka, Komashivka area. It makes more sense that this won't look like this. I think there's going to be a lot of grey zone, but not 16-kilometre penetrations that sit grey for a very long time. You may have that of a DRG element, but not for very long as far as actual control. Now let's move our way up. We'll come to then Konstantinivska area, and we do see Suryak map confirming on the eastern side here that during last week, Ukraine army managed to bring reinforcements to the eastern outskirts of Konstantinivka city and managed to expel Russian army from the nearby trenches. So we did have multiple reports of right down onto Konstantinivka from Stopochke front that Russia was accumulating some level of forces, whether it was DRG or larger elements in this, but he's saying that Ukraine has been pushing these out. And we'll move our way up, and we have in Minkivka, just here to the north of Chasiv Yar. What we do see in this footage here is the Russians using thermobaric TOS systems. Now, the reason we always talk about this is in the strategy that we see the Russians use, that we are observing, typically this is one of the last, if not the last, weapon system of artillery used before there is armoured or ground movements into these areas. So don't be surprised if we start seeing more movement around there. It's just worth to bring up. And we'll go on to the Terny area. Some areas to be familiar with: Novomyalivka, Novimir as well. You can see areas down right to Novoselivska area too. And Suryak is saying that these areas are looking a fair bit different. So advances on the south and the north. Let's focus on the south for now, where this is moving. See where this road comes in these two tree lines, that he's claiming right down onto this road here, just to the east of Novoselivska, that this is advanced down to here, further threatening that Liman-Siversk area, and in the direction of Hashklikove as well, moving along this border, oblast border line into separate areas, both to the west and to the north. So keep an eye on all of that happening. Again, Terny is greatly underappreciated of what is actually occurring on this axis at the moment, as well as Kupiansk. So keep an eye on everything to do with that. Now, I've said for some time, we're going to go over this book, Russia Against Modernity, from then Professor Alexander Etkind. Now, I've got a lot of notes on this as well, so let's go through all of this. And the first thing I'll say about this is, I don't know Mr. Alexander Etkind, but this book screams to me of typical left-wing academia by using superior language on purpose to give authority and a sense of intellectual superiority, basically to be, if you don't agree, that's because you don't understand, and it's because you're academically inferior. That's how I read a lot of bits and pieces like this. I think, especially in the left-wing academics, screams that. Rather than just laying out clearly, precisely your reasoning, that hiding it behind this illusion of big words and difficult to understand. And if you don't understand it, it's because it's your fault, not that I didn't just give a reason. And one of the best opening lines is in a Mearsheimer book. It's a criticism of liberalism, but he says that you must teach as if the entire university, from the professors to the janitor, is standing in your theatre. And the direct quote from that is, you must aim to be a great communicator, not a great obfuscator, which I think is very, very true. And that's one of the things I really try and do here. Now, the moment I finished this book, and it is a really good read, it's short. It only took me a day and a half to get through, and it is well written, but you may need to look up some of the words in it. We'll go over some that you're going to need to know. But the first thing I did as soon as I finished that last page is I flicked to the front and went, when the fuck was this published? And as soon as I saw 2023, I went, that makes sense. And Mr. Etkind does have a whole chapter about the dangers of making predictions and naming people that have made now incorrect predictions, especially before 22. Now, those predictions before 22 from people, these were in line with intelligence assessments about how this war would go. But he has a whole chapter on the danger of making these predictions and these people looking the way they do. But in the subsequent chapters, he does not just predict, but confirms, no questions about it, the Russian Federation's eventual loss in the war and complete collapse into multiple different areas, and disregards any nuance, other outcomes that may occur, and catastrophic events, being a nuclear superpower, that this could have as well, and actually pays off and brushes over those devastating weapons, those extinction level weapon systems. We'll go through this book more. We'll go through, not page by page, but all the notes that I did make throughout. Now, very early on, he brings in this idea of Anthropocene. And it says early, to survive the Anthropocene, go over what that is, we need to trust the experts. You can see, as soon as you hear that, a lot of people go, because when you hear this trust the experts again and again, I think a lot of people's ears prick up, as well as talking about climate and using the term Anthropocene in that. We'll talk about what that specifically is, but that anyone who questions the climate narrative is being disillusioned by Russian cyber intelligence operations. So if you question this, it's a Russian cyber intel operation that you have been affected by, okay? And it uses the spicy flu, the Rona, I can't say the word on here, as an argument to solidify trusting the experts, which in my opinion is laughable now that we are years on. Now, also in this, multiple times, Mr. Etkind, he unquestionably, in multiple occurrences, states that Trump was elected into office, into the presidency, with Russian intelligence help, that it was an operation from the Kremlin. Now, not only has this been debunked, there's zero evidence to support this, and evidence at all that would have that much impact. So you can see already, people reading this, you need to push on if you're going to read this through some of that, because there are some really good points in this. Mr. Etkind as well, another bit that does concern me is he questions, I don't know why, and it's unclear why Russia is using AZ marking. It's not unclear. It was known from the first day of the war. Now, it's become synonymous with the Russian military now. Now it's being held as more of a symbol of victory. But Western group of forces. There's an O and a V. I thought everyone knew that, and that it brings in the legitimacy of knowledge here too. Now, I used a word there you may not know, Anthropocene, and what this refers to is a current geological time or geological epoch, climate time, what is happening at now, and defined by significant human impact on the Earth's geology and ecosystem. So it's geological time of the current day, okay? And we also need to bring in a couple of other words I mentioned yesterday, and we'll do it in his words, because if you do it in his words, therefore it gives what he actually meant by that, because the definitions for things can be vastly different between paleomodernity and Gaia-modernity as well. That paleomodernity, which is where he's saying Russia sits within, is defined progress in terms of expanding use of nature. The more resources we used and the more energy consumed, the higher was the civilization. For Gaia-modernity, in contrast, the further advancement of humanity requires less energy used and less matter consumed per every new unit of work and pleasure. The two types of modernity present opposite relations between nature and progress, or where more people would see where conservatism is with drill baby drill of Russia, through to progressivism of then live in smaller houses, more communal, solar panels, green energy, etc., in really simple terms. But that Russia, as he would refer to as a petrol state, we'll go over more, is in this paleomodernity, drilling up and expanding with little regard for the climate and the Gaia-modernity of what we see where Europe is somewhat trying to head. But what is completely left out in this too is it just assumes that all Europeans or all Westerners and everyone is on board with Gaia-modernity. They're on board with what's happening in the climate and what your prediction is at all of this, okay? On board with using less resources and living in smaller houses and living more communally in all of this, and not ownership. Like it's assuming that everyone's on board with this slow down. And what I would say is the appetite for paleomodernity and digging out of the ground, that is not reflected across America, across Australia. Look at how our whole economy is based on digging shit out of the ground. And many, many Europeans absolutely despise this movement, this, if you will, progressive liberalist movement at the moment. That's why we see a rise of the right and this assumption that everyone just agrees with this. And if you don't agree with it, you've been influenced by some SVR cyber operation somewhere. But the overall premise of the book is that Russia launched its full-scale war against modernity and against Gaia-modernity to preserve the status quo and the paleo-modern resource exporter, themselves being a petrostate and oil being such a big part of their economy. Now, I don't disagree with the premise of war against modernity, but I think misses the point a little bit if you're just speaking about resource digging stuff out of the ground, rather than far more to do with where liberalism is growing and expanding in globalization. And we're going to look through Mr. Dugan's work a bit later to break down the criticisms and this multipolar reality that we're seeing and what we saw yesterday in Beijing too. Now, what I will say is Etkind has absolute Russophobia, despite, I believe, being born in St. Petersburg. Maybe that is the reason why. But he refuses to add any nuance at all to Russia, to its leaders, to the history of those leaders, to even down to literature, to follow and following just a accepted narrative that everyone accepts. It's just corrupt shithole gas station with nuclear weapons, which many people push back against. Many people accept that there's a lot of this, but you can't just boil it down to this. And this is what I talk about over and over, is so many try and oversimplify this war to push a much easier narrative. And I read this book that Mr. Etkind is more of an advocate than an analyst. And we've gone over the difference in this before. But in it, he doesn't clearly lay out whatsoever that how invading Ukraine is seen as an advantage to Russia to maintain paleo-modernity. Knowing that the Russians knew full well that massive sanctions would be enacted. Now, of course, they believed they would occupy significantly more territory, potentially in the trillions of dollars of more resources, but at the same time, you're trying to fight back against countries not wanting to use these in gay modernity, but by knowing you're going to launch an invasion that is going to have sanctions, so then they don't want Russia knew that the gas and oil was going to be restricted following this. They built up certain areas in their economy that's going to be buffered by sanctions over the past decade. That's exactly why these sanctions haven't hit as hard. It wasn't like unknown. It was like unprecedented sanctions. So it doesn't lay out clearly that how this then affected that. Now, I saw from another review of this book, the intended advantage of invading Ukraine was to lock Russia into paleomodernity by crushing a neighbouring state that was drifting toward a rival model. And that drift towards rival model, but what I don't get is the step between this is how does that, even if Ukraine wants to become a gay modernist state, which we know there's a lot of pushback against that, especially in Eastern Europe, and Ukraine is more conservative than the Eastern EU countries. There's still something in that I've missed, but I've tried to rack my brain on. Now, one thing he does lay out very well is he does speak very well and breaks down simply Russian elite and oligarchs' insane wealth production and the corruption that occurs and how this wealth doesn't stay in Russia and therefore it's not disseminated at all amongst the population, and speaks about how oil money made by the 1% is spent in other economies and how oil itself is not labour intensive. So that pool of money stays in a very small group and then is spent on everything from yachts to Louis Vuitton outside of the Russian tax system, and how these elites just grow and grow and grow in oligarchical power. Now, it doesn't touch on the involvement of creating oligarchy following the rushed shift to a market economy as well that we saw at the collapse of the Soviet Union. It doesn't touch on the West's involvement in that occurring as well. Now, he does list the name Jeffrey Sachs in this, but doesn't go over that Jeffrey Sachs was literally involved in this. And if Jeffrey Sachs is speaking about economic woes and some problems that have occurred that have been forced into shift from then a closed non-market economy to a market economy, he was involved in that. He was the economist with the Harvard boys doing that. So it brushes over any involvement there. It's just, no, it's because everyone's shit. That's the reason why it happened. Now, we said that an oil state, and he speaks very well of this, requires very little labour, so the profits are not shared equally like a labour state is. And this is correct. We do see the ruble follow oil. But it does fail to take into account that the amount of labour that war requires too. This is why there's inflation. Well, one of the reasons why there's inflation, because there's more people working in factories 24/7. And this is the reason why unemployment is so low as well. And we are absolutely heading into a more turbulent and militarized world. And Russian equipment will be on more high demand as these dividing lines get drawn. Just listen to Trump speaking about India's military. So in the very beginning of this, he speaks that war changes everything. It changes states completely. And he is correct. I fully agree that war does. Even states with imperialistic ambition, with bloodthirsty ambition, even when they lose, they may recover in the next decades spectacularly. Look at Germany, look at Japan. And even victors can go the opposite way too. That does not confirm the outcome over the next century. But what I was reading, because he's talking about this war is going to change Europe for the good and it'll just change Russia and reinforce the paleomodernity that's going to collapse everything. But I was reading it going, maybe a war, the forces of nature of war, is what will actually drive Russia to create more efficient systems of trade, of business, of governance. And this idea that if we need to fight a war that's now become existential for the state, we need to clamp down on corruption due to its nature on efficiency, not clamping down on the corruption itself, but if we need to increase efficiency in this system, that's what we need to go down onto. And there's also this, and that's the change I'm getting at, is that war will only change positive for the West and will only change negative for Russia. And I've said, well, it could change positive for both. We could see in decades to come, regardless if Russia win or lose, we could see a completely different Russia evolve under the pressures of this war. It's not that all event horizons point towards a collapsed oil petrostate, like he will say. Now, the idea that the global demand and appetite for oil and gas is gone is a very Western, highbrow, utopian vision. The appetite for oil and gas, Russian oil and gas in the EU, is still massive. And if it's not there, it's in China or it's in India. This idea that there's no demand for it is ridiculous. And what this doesn't take into account is this utopian game eternity vision that the billions who are in poverty, where green energy is unobtainable, that may sacrifice to reach these utopian visions. It's very easy to preach solar panels when you're working as a professor on I presume, a very good wage in Austria. Now, nor does it take into account at all the appetite for massive, cheap energy that building up for war requires, of just melting down steel, or artificial intelligence that is already there too. So what we need to contrast is this against Dugin. And I've done a fair bit of reading on Dugin because of the involvement somewhat he's said to have into the Kremlin. So you try to get an idea of that. But again, the actual evidence of Dugin meeting Putin or having any involvement is very limited. But I think it gives a good balance between far left, far right. And this is where you should always be reading things that challenge you, whether it's from Etkin to Dugin to Hitchens to anyone. You always should do that, not just keep an echo chamber of yourself. And that is, don't just watch my channel as well. Now, to break down, there's two books we're going to go through, not long, but Theory of a Multipolar World and The Fourth Political Theory. And I've ripped these apart before. I can do a piece on them if you would like, and where I see massive holes in this too. But the Fourth Political Theory is his attempt to move beyond the main three ideologies of the 20th century. Of course, liberalism, communism, and fascism. Of course, with liberalism in the wars coming to the forefront and capitalist democracies, we saw the outcome into the 21st century of this as well. But Dugin argues that all three have failed in different ways, and he's proposing a fourth. It doesn't clearly define how it would look, but it is built on traditionalism, spirituality, and cultural identity rather than individualism or material progress. So a pushback on with communism, fascism, liberalism, realism, if you will, and progressive liberalism, if you will, as well. And the thing is where this is interesting, this traditional spirituality and cultural identity, this relates a lot to the decrees we see Mr. President Putin release as well around in the satanic West and the traditional Russia, the bastion of which is trying to be formed. And at its core, what Dugin is speaking about is anti-liberal, anti-globalist, and stresses the importance of civilizations defending their unique traditions against Western universalism. So this idea that the world become a liberal Western universal state and exported on that, and this pushback of civilizations in the theory of multipolar world, that dividing lines between civilizations will be drawn, not nation states. A fair bit in that, but I think I have a very, very intelligent audience who gets a lot of this. And in then Mr. Etkin's book on page 78, he actually speaks about unknown assassins killing then Daria Dugin, Alexander Dugin's daughter. He also draws that Putin launched and reproduced the Great Terror of the Soviet period. Now, what I will say on that is what has occurred is terrible, it is shocking, and I don't think it can be justified. But drawing these conclusions against the Great Terror, where millions upon millions died and what was happening, again, there's this drawing parallels to be an advocate, not to analyse in that as well. Now, he does talk about this too, and this is where I think just missing the point about, he's speaking about in mining, oil, these like industry like this, that women are just as capable of working in these, but it's greed and fear. This is the reasons they're not in there, of male chauvinism and homophobia. And in my opinion, no, that's not the reason women work in these dirty, dangerous, heavy industry. Australia is an incredibly free country. It is very, very illegal to discriminate against men and women. And the mining companies here, which are the biggest in the world, do absolutely everything they can to get women in. And there's still a massive imbalance of women, and a lot of the women who work at these mines aren't down the fucking shaft. It's other ancillary jobs. So to say that it's just based on that of why we see in Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Russia, that's the reason I think is missing a whole point. It's like women are they may be just as capable, but they still have nature of maybe not wanting to do that job as well. That's why we don't see 50-50 in a lot of industries. We don't see 50-50 male preschool teachers, and you're never going to see 50-50 women coal miners either. He does touch on fantastically, I actually think, at 92 about fatherlessness and how this is a crisis in Russia, but it's also a crisis in the Western world as well. And I really love, he does speak on, I haven't got actually a marking in the chapter here, but how a child sitting down with his father at the end of the day is like looking through a window at the bigger world, and that experience the kids get. And I think that is a very, very good point. Again, page 116 is where he speaks about, whatever the truth behind the Z, maybe it's zombie films, maybe it's the Z half the swastika, maybe it's for Zelensky. It was a military marking on a vehicle. We have V's in different ways, or a chevron. Now, I'm not calling for the collapse of the Russian Federation. I am predicting it, which is by no means the same thing. People like me who look forward to Ukraine's total victory and seeing Russian rulers tried in international court on page 121. And this comes the page after the warning and dangers against making predictions. And then in page 138, he goes over then when Russia collapses, not if, but when it collapses, about they're going to have to, or in the war, they're going to confront such difficulties. Rulers now have to decide whether to use nuclear weapons. On the one hand, if they were not used, the Russian Federation would lose the war. But if they do get used, you know how that will look. But again, it takes into account that Russia can't then occupy these areas, of which maybe just the oblasts, without the use of nuclear weapons. And how it says that these ancient weapons have never been used, the decades are sat in storage and used by dates extended many times. So you hear this again and again about these have never been used, they've sat in storage, they don't get used. Again, Mr. Etkin and the people online, they're not the ones who are pushing the button on that. And obviously, America do believe that these weapons may be useful. And what I've said previously is even if 99% of Russia's nuclear weapons fail to leave the tube, at 1%, the devastation from that is unbelievable. And it could trigger an extinction level event. So it's all of these again, which is more advocate rather than what are you actually bringing forward if these are out of date, not being used, that they can't be used either. Because we see if the Western leaders and intelligence agencies truly believe that, they'd operate in a very different way against Russia. Absolutely, we would. Now, most important thing is weapons, never meant to use them, and it would never sell oil again, somehow lived without oil. So he's giving this utopian vision of how he sees Russia coming forward, that we'll never use oil again, the oligarchs are gone, it's been broken into multiple different states, and oil that could never be sold for weapons, that could not be used to send to the country into an enormous warehouse for the, quote, dirtiest scum on earth. And speaks about these new states that will be developed out of this collapse, that some will be democratic, some will be authoritarian. So 100% there's going to be a collapse of the Russian Federation, and that the world's going to shift, and would China shift from Taiwan to Siberia with their focus. And we did go over the other day, that real threat to China on Russia, that China could shift focus, not only shift focus, and they could dual focus, that maybe have Russia in their sights. But again, I think for China, significantly more cost effective to do trade at a reduced price, but increased rate with Russia while no one else is buying, or not no one else, but while other nations aren't buying their resources, way cheaper, way easier, way less risky than actually launching some level of invasion. The cost whole just doesn't line up. But I enjoyed it. It was good. I think there's some major holes in it. But again, like I said in the very beginning of this, as soon as I finished, I went, when the fuck was this written? Went to 23 and went, okay, this is where you're coming from, with a misunderstanding of how the opening days, months, even years of war cannot predict the outcomes of this, even after crushing defeats. And if you're talking about Russia's history of recovery after a crushing defeat is absolutely there. And how does Kissinger put it? Like a tide rising and lowering again, how Russia is on a rhythm of this too over many centuries of being up, being down, recovering on a very unique way. I hope I've given you some level of information about that, not just waffle. Legends, look after yourselves. Have a great day, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.